Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a video about the Pro-line Ultra Reservoir shocks. Now, these are the new ones that they just came out with. They're fairly expensive, but I kind of wanted to go all out with the shocks since shocks are one of my favorite parts of the truck. So I bought these. They're fairly expensive, but I think they're worth it. They're really cool. You can adjust like a ton of different aspects of them. So first I'll do a demonstration showing what they do. So the first thing you'll notice on the outside is that it's two dual stage springs. So at the beginning of the compression stage, it's easier to compress and it gets harder. Also on top of that, there's this thing right here, which is a spring adjuster nut, and this part hits it, this thing that separates the spring hits that nut, and that prevents the first spring from moving any farther. See, and then the second spring takes over, so you can actually adjust when that happens, which is really useful. So it allows you to control it more. So that's for the springs. Now I'll take the springs off to show you. And on the inside, see how when I push it down it comes out? That's because there's actually a spring inside the reservoir and a piston, which is this and this, that the oil pushes against, and it causes it to have pressure, so that way you can push it comes out. And also you can adjust that pressure by turning this nut in and out, this set screw. And if I have it almost all the way out, then it's really hard it's like way easier, but then as I turn it in, you'll notice that the shaft starts to come out a little bit and gets a little easier. See, comes out more. So also included are these smaller hole pistons, so you can adjust the size of the holes of the pistons to make it have more dampening or less dampening. I'm using the included ones because I want to test those out first. And finally, there are a ton of different ways you can build these. So you can have it so it's really hard to push down, but I just have a little bit. That's the way I built them. So now I'll do a demonstration showing how I build them. So before I start the build, I like to make something clear, and that is that I'm going to assemble these different than Pro-line does. So they made a video on how they assembled them, and I suggest you watch their video. It's really well done, and it explains a lot. And however, at the end, what ended up happening is this set screw was out all the way, and that's a problem because it can easily fall out, and I didn't want that. So basically what I did was I started with the piston all the way down at the back, and that way it basically has more room to move, so that way it's not starting there and then barely has any space. So that way I can have the set screw all the way in, and also to go along with that I had the shaft all the way out, so that way when you push the shaft it displaces the oil and causes the piston to move forward, and it has more room to move. Also, because you're always starting with it out, always starting the piston in the same spot, it yields a fairly consistent result. So I found that for most of them I didn't need to use this bleed screw because they were very consistent and I didn't really see a need to. So yeah, so if you want to see how to use the bleed screw, watch their video. They do a very good demonstration on that, but I'll show you the way I assembled them. So now I'll show you. So you will need a adjustable wrench, a 2mm hex driver, one of these nut drivers for the nut on the piston, a pair of vice grips coated with electrical tape, and that's to grab the shock shaft, and this grabs it without damaging it. There are tools you can use to do this, but this is a cheap method that works well. And also I will be taking apart the entire shock and putting green slime. This is optional, but I don't want any oil to leak, so this stuff works really well to keep oil from leaking, so I'm just going to put that on all the O-rings. And finally you'll need Loctite. So the first thing is to just remove the main body and the piggyback. And as you can see, there are two O-rings in there. I'll be putting green slime on both of those eventually, as with all the O-rings that touch oil. And so the next thing is to remove that cap from the piggyback, and that's for later. You will have to do this even though you don't put on the green slime, but that's just to get the piston in there. And the next thing is to remove the cartridge. There's this nut that holds the X-ring and the two plastic pieces in, and that comes off first, as you can see, and then the plastic piece comes off. You don't have to take that off first, but then there's also the part that screws on. So there's two different large parts for the cartridge. So what I'm doing is I'm just removing the cartridge now, and I'm going to completely take it apart to get in there and put green slime on the X-ring. And as you can see, the nut on there isn't tightened at all on the shaft, and so even if you don't do the green slime, you will have to tighten that nut down. So right now I'm removing the cartridge to put green slime on the X-ring in there, but before I do that, I will tighten that nut. So that's what the vice grips are for. Just grab it with the vice grips and tighten that nut down, and just tighten it enough so it doesn't move up and down. It was moving a little bit back and forth, but that's fine as long as it's not jumping up and down on you. So as you can see, it's good. So the next thing is to take apart the cartridge completely. There's two plastic pieces which surround the X-ring, and then the X-ring in the middle. And the X-ring, I am going to be putting green slime, and here's the two plastic pieces with the X-ring in the middle. And you will have to remember which direction they go in, because that does matter. So I'm taking the X-ring and then put green slime all over it, in the inside and the outside, to make sure that it's covered completely. Then just put it back together the way it came apart. Start with the plastic piece that goes on the top, and then the X-ring, and then the other plastic piece, and the nut that holds this all together. One thing you will note is that nut tightens it down, so it's very hard to get that shaft on if you tighten the nut down like I did. I didn't realize this. So make sure you don't tighten that down too hard. Just tighten it, just like do it a little bit, and then get the shaft on, because otherwise you will damage the X-ring if you force it on, because there's threads on the shaft. So next I'm just putting some more green slime on the large O-ring on the cartridge. So yeah, I didn't realize that nut on the cartridge tightened it, and as you can see here, I'm trying to put that on, and I'm not able to until I loosen that. So yeah, don't do what I did. Make sure that you make sure you loosen that nut, otherwise you will damage the X-ring. So yeah, I loosened it, and then it went straight on. See, and then I tighten it again. So yeah, so now the cartridge and piston is complete. So now I'm going to put green slime on the shock cap that I showed earlier. So to do that, I used the end part of the green slime tube to rub it on there, and my finger also. And I'm not putting like a ton on there, I was just using it to rub it on. So yeah, make sure it's all over the top of each of those O-rings to completely prevent oil from leaking. I'm not putting like on the whole time, I'm just using that to rub it around. Also, make sure those holes that the oil flows through aren't blocked. So I got some in there, so I just used that shirt to remove some of it. So then just screw the piggyback and the main body on. Now make sure you don't screw it too tight, otherwise you will damage the O-rings. So just enough so it's flush with the aluminum. So now what you'll do is, before you fill it, you'll want to assemble the reservoir piston, which I'll show later, but I didn't realize that. I did it in the wrong order. So, but to fill it, what you'll do is you'll fill up the reservoir, and basically what happens is the oil from the reservoir flows into the main body, and it pushes out the air bubbles when it does that. So that's why you want to fill it in the reservoir, to get all those air bubbles out. So you just fill it up completely in the reservoir and then wait for the oil level to drop a little bit. And just do that a few times until you have like a couple millimeters inside the main body of oil. And then you can fill the main body the rest of the way. But just fill the reservoir a few times to make sure all those air bubbles are out. And yeah, I did this in the wrong order. You'll want to do this next. Otherwise, the difference in volume will cause some of the oil to flow out of the reservoir. So I did have to dump some of the oil out, but I just refilled it. So yeah, so as you can see, just fill it up the main body the rest of the way. And I put too much in there, so a lot of it flowed out. And at this point, I realized I'd done it wrong, because I tried to set it to the side, but the difference of volume caused some of the oil in the reservoir to flow out. So yeah, I put it to the side, but then it started coming out, as you can see now. So yeah, then I realized it, and yeah, so then I just unscrewed the bottle of oil and dumped some of the oil out of the main body, not out of the reservoir, just out of the main body, to get the volume levels about equal. Some did end up coming out of the reservoir, but there was plenty in there. So then I assembled the piston, which is what you want to do before you fill up the shock with oil. So the piston, it's this plastic piece with an X-ring that goes on top of it. Now this part's kind of hard because you have to stretch the X-ring around it, and it likes to like flip over. But if you do it right, you can flip it back with like your fingernail. So basically I just put green slime to lubricate it and then just stretched it over the end there. And it's on, but it likes to roll over, so I just used my fingernail to roll it back. And you can tell when it's correct because it looks nice all the way around. It's not like flipped. So there, it's nice and it's even all the way around. So then I just put some more green slime, because you will need a lot here because there's threads in the reservoir that you put this on, and if you don't lubricate it enough, the threads will damage the X-ring and cause it to tear. So yeah, make sure that the piston is well lubricated. Also, there's an air hole on the side of the piston, so let all the air out like I'm doing right now, then push it in. Once all the air's out, there's a little hole to get all the air out. So yeah, push it in and use like a screw or something, and you really want to be careful because the threads for the reservoir cap will damage the X-ring. So I just used the round part of a screw to push it in. And I was slowly making sure I wasn't doing any damage. So yeah, once it's in, I pushed it down all the way to the back. And then wiped off any extra oil. So the next part was to assemble the piston and cartridge to the body, and I made sure the shaft is sticking all the way out like that. I pulled it out after I put it in to make sure that all the air bubbles are out. Then you just screw on the cartridge like so. And I started with the shaft all the way out again. And I double checked that the piston is all the way at the bottom, which it was. So then use the wrench to tighten the cartridge down. You don't need to tighten this a lot again, just enough so it's flush, because otherwise you'll damage the O-ring. The green slime plus the O-ring causes a very good seal, so you don't need to tighten it a ton. So yeah, so now I just finished putting the pieces in the reservoir. So there's a spring that goes in, and then there's a spring cap, and it has a bump on one side, and the bump side goes down towards the spring. That way it like holds the spring. So then the reservoir cap goes on. I didn't put green slime on this since there's no oil going against it. So I just screwed that on and used the wrench to get it on the rest of the way. And that's what the threads in the reservoir are for. That could cause the piston with the X-ring to tear. So yes, and then the last step is to just put the set screw in, and it uses a 2mm bit, and I screwed it down all the way so there's basically no chance of it coming out. And you can see now the shaft goes in and it comes back out once you press it. So finally I put the end cap on, but before I did that, I put some thread lock on it. That way, because it's metal on metal, to make sure it doesn't come off over time. You don't need too much, just a little bit. So screw that end cap, rod end on, sorry. So finally, the last steps are to put the springs and the spring retainer on. And here I was just showing that it works. So the primary spring, which is a smaller one, goes on first, then the spring divider, then the secondary spring, then the spring retainer. And the tolerances between the spring retainer and the shaft were very tight, so that was kind of difficult to get on. And as you can see, it works, and it's very smooth. So yeah, so now I'll show you a time lapse of me assembling the other two shocks.
I was too young, and I didn't understand that you were the one, and I can't wait to see
you again. Hello, so I finished building the shocks, and I cleaned up the area, and so I'll show them. So the first thing you should notice is that these are way larger. So here's a side-by-side comparison. Everything is fatter. The reservoir, the body, even the shaft, it's all bigger, it's stronger, longer, everything, which is nice. Another thing is these are way smoother. So if you listen to this, you can hear that air in there because these have to have air. Otherwise, it's very difficult to build them, from what I found. And listen to this. It's so smooth. I love these things. For the rear, because they're so long, I had to move the shock tower over to the next hole over, which was pretty easy. But for the front, I had to make a custom bracket. Can't really see it, I'll take off the body. And they're fairly ghetto, but they work. And it wasn't that hard to make, it's just a piece of steel that I cut out. And it mounts to that, and that raises it up about 10 millimeters because otherwise the front drive shaft started binding, which was a huge issue. The rear drive shaft doesn't bind, however, so I just left it like this. And there's a ton of travel. And it's really smooth. Now, the one problem I did have with these shocks, which isn't really a problem, it was just a building thing. Well, when I was building one of them, the reservoir so on the reservoir, you have to push the blue X-ring piston in. And what happened was the threads in there catch on it. So it actually, one of them, it caused the X-ring to actually rip. Luckily, it's usable since it only ripped like one of the rings because it has like 2 rings on it. But I'm hoping that doesn't leak. If it does start leaking, Pro-line does make a rebuild kit for these, so I'll just pick up that and I'll be good to go. But that only happened once out of the 4 shocks, so you have to be like really careful to not do that when you build them, because otherwise it will rip for sure, and that was a problem. So other than that, these things went together fairly easily. I didn't really notice any problems. And on the SCX10 in particular, you will have to move a few things around, and especially create these brackets, otherwise you will get drive shaft binding. So on the front, I actually made it the same height as the original shocks were, so there's like not really more travel on here because it's the same height. But on the rear, there's like 5 to 10 millimeters, 10 probably more travel, which is nice. And yeah, so overall, if you get these shocks for the SCX10, you will want to get a shock moving kit. I know they sell them, it's like a lift kit thing, or you can just make your own like I did. It didn't take that long. It was just drilling a few holes and cutting it, and that should hold up. And they went together fairly easy. They're extremely smooth and nice, and they're definitely an improvement over the stock ones, so I'd highly recommend these. So yeah, thank you for watching, and if you want to see more on this truck, check out the playlist in the card in the video, and thank you.